But some soft is also late. Mechanically, the car is hunky-dory.
Mechanically, the car is hunky-dory.
But some software widgets that are a big selling point these days
But some software widgets that are a big selling point these days,
rumored to include smartphone connectivity and augmented reality parking assistance,
rumored to include smartphone connectivity and augmented reality parking assistance,
may be missing at first, only to be added later.
may be missing at first, only to be added later.
Originally set for this summer,
Originally set for this summer,
the launch has been pushed back until at least September.
the launch has been pushed back until at least September.
VW is not the only big company struggling to make its computers work.
VW is not the only company struggling to make its computers work.
Last year, British banks were hauled over the coals
Last year, British banks were hauled over the coals
by regulators for its work. Last year, British banks were hauled over the coals
Last year, the British banks were hauled over the coals
by regulators for online outages, and botched banks were hauled over the coals by regulators for online outages and botched IT upgrades.
by regulators for online upgrades and botched
Regulators for online outages and botched IT upgrades
for online outages and botched IT upgrades
that left millions of customers unable to make or receive payments.
that left millions of customers unable to make or receive payments.
Some problems are much more serious.
Some problems are much more serious.
Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019
Boeing 737 aircraft were grounded in 2019
after two fatal 737 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019 after two fatal crashes caused partly by software flaws.
after two fatal crashes caused partly by software flaws.
After two fatal crashes caused partly by a software flaw.
Caused partly by a software flaw.
Investigators have since found lesser bugs.
Investors have since found lesser bugs.
Airlines are, for instance, now advised to turn the plane off and on again. Airlines are, for instance, now advised to turn the plane off and on again.
Airlines are now advised, for instance, to turn the airplane off and on again
Every 51 days
every 51 days
stop its computers displaying false data in
to stop its computers displaying false data.
Every 51 days to stop its computers displaying false data in mid-flight.
In mid-flight.
A similar problem found in 2017 in some aeroplanes made by Airbus. Boeing's European rival prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency to Boeing's European rival prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency to require that such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours. That such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours.
At least every 149 hours.
Blame for companies' IT woes
Blame for companies' IT woes
often ends up in the boardroom. Blame for companies' IT woes
Blame for companies' IT woes
often ends up in the boardroom. Sometimes that is fair.
Sometimes that is fair.
Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign
Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign
as Boeing's CEO after Mullenberg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing's CEO
as Boeing CEO
after the tragic 737 MAX disasters.
after the tragic 737 MAX disaster.
But not always,
But not always.
for software is hard
For software is hard
and hard to keep up with. Not always, for software is hard and hard to keep up with.
and hard to keep up with.
And the employees expected to produce it are often the products of a with. And the employees expected to produce it are often the products of keep up with. And the employees expected to produce it
And the employee is expected to produce it.
are often the products of a discipline that
Are often the products of a discipline
is in many ways expected to produce it are often the products of a discipline that is in many ways oddly pre-modern.
that is in many ways oddly pre-modern.
When software is eating the world,
When software is eating the world,
Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are to a greater or lesser extent Valley speak for when software is eating the world, Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are to a greater or lesser extent software companies.
Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most companies, to a greater or lesser extent, are software companies.
Situation where most firms are to a greater or lesser extent software companies. That matters.
That matters.
Start with the computer code itself.
Start with the computer code itself.
Programming requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity.
Coding requires a mix of hyper-literal.
Programming requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity.
Coding requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity.
Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation mark.
Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation mark
Can completely change how a system behaves.
Can completely change how a system behaves.
An industry rule of thumb is that depending on how carefully they work.
And an industry rule of thumb is that depending on how carefully they work.
Programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors.
Programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors.
In work, programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors in every 1,000 lines of code they write.
In 1,000 codes of they write.
50 errors in every 1,000 lines of code they write.
In every 1,000 lines of code they write.
50 errors in every 1,000 lines of code they write.
In every 1,000 lines of code they write.
Because cars and aircraft contain tens of millions of lines.
Because cars and aircraft contain millions of lines.
The chances of an error-free system are in effect zero.
The chances of
an error-free system are in effect zero.
The chances of an error-free system is in effect zero.
Even when bugs do not lead to catastrophe.
Even when bugs do not lead to catastrophe.
They put a constant drag on a firm's productivity.
They put on a constant drag on a firm's creativity.
To catastrophe. They put a constant drag on a firm's productivity. A survey commissioned by Stripe, a digital payments processor.
A survey commissioned by Stripe,
a digital payments processor.
A digital payment processor
Suggested the average developer spends 21 hours a week.
Suggests that the average developer spends
Suggested the average developer spends 21 hours a week.
Suggests that the average developer spends 21 hours a week
fixing old or bad code.
Fixing old or bad code.
Developer spends 21 hours a week fixing old or bad code. The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse.
The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse.
Code. The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse
The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse
by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession.
by the shortcomings of
Programming is made worse by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession.
by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession.
These are laid out in a book. The problem
These are laid out in a book.
with software. Why smart engineers write bad code. The problem with software.
The problem with software.
Why smart engineers write bad code.
Why smart engineers write bad code.
The author, Adam Barr, spent 20 years as a developer for Microsoft.
The author, Adam Barr, spent 20 years as a developer for Microsoft,
The software giant.
the software giant.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct.
That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct.
That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct. There is too little communication between academia and industry.
There is too little communication between academia and industry,
And no real agreement on what to teach.
and no real agreement on what to teach
Or what habits to instill.
or what habits to instill.
The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in which folklore and fads too often take the result, argues Mr. Barr, or what habits to instill. The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in which folklore and fads.
The result is a field, Mr. Barr argued.
The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in which folklore and fads.
The result, Mr. Barr argues, is a field in which fads and folklore
Too often take the place of professional standards.
too often take the place of professional standards.
To illustrate the field's shaky foundations, Mr. Barr points to the practice popular with technology firms like
Mr. Barr points to the practice popular with technology firms
Google or Apple
like Google or Apple
of giving job candidates a programming problem to solve on a whiteboard.
of giving job candidates a programming problem to solve on a whiteboard.
Of giving job candidates a programming problem to solve on a whiteboard. Few other fields behave that way
Few other fields behave that way
because they assume that by dint of having graduated,
because they assume by dint of having graduated.
other fields behave that way because they assume that by dint of having graduated, applicants have already achieved a basic level of competence.
That applicants achieved a basic level of competence.
Doctors do not expect anatomy quizzes before being hired.
Doctors do not expect autonomy quizzes before being hired.
Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to prove their bona fide. Mechanical engineers are not anatomy quizzes before being hired. Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to
Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down motion laws of Newton.
Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion
Newton's laws of motion
to prove their bona fides.
to prove their bona fides.
All those problems are compounded by software engineering's breathless rate of change.
All
Problems are compounded by software engineering's breathless rate of change.
all those problems are compounded by software engineering's breathless rate of change.
Even when a system works,
Even when a system works,
it rapidly becomes obsolete.
it rapidly becomes obsolete.
The woes of British banks are largely the result of
The woes of British banks are largely the result of
trying to maintain such legacy systems.
trying to maintain those legacy systems
written by long-departed programmers, often outsourced in half-forgotten computer languages,
outsourced in half-forgotten computer languages,
to satisfy criteria no one can quite remember. Coders under pressure to add nifty new features
Coders under pressure to add nifty new features
often cut corners, storing up problems for the ever less distant future.
often cut corners, storing up problems for the ever less distant future.
The result, says one expert with decades of experience,
The result, says one expert with decades of experience,
is that shiny new IT systems can rapidly devolve into rickety, half-understood contraptions
can devolve into rickety, half-understood contraption
held together with gaffer tape and a prayer.
A prayer.
Understood contraptions held together with gaffer tape and a prayer. Eventually, the costs become too great to ignore. And companies must upgrade their systems. That is the moment ignore. And companies must upgrade their systems. But that is the moment of maximum danger. For the new software must do everything that the half-understood old one does. For the new software must do everything. But that is the moment of maximum danger. For the new software must do everything that the half-understood old one does. For the new software must do what all half-understood old one does. Because the new software must do what the half-understood old one does, and more. It is, to repeat a common but apposite analogy,
like rebuilding an aircraft in flight.
VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks with VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks.
VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks
With the ID.3's snazzy features. The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house.
The firm
wants to bring most software development back in-house. Features. The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house.
The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house.
The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house. And has spent €7 billion, that's 8 billion, software development back in-house. And has spent €7 billion, that's 8 billion. Development back in-house. And has spent €7 billion, that's $8 billion.
And has spent €7 billion, that's $8 billion.
On a shiny new digital unit. That is probably a good idea. However, as Mr. Barr argues, the structural problems with writing software mean
the structural problems with writing software.
As Mr. Barr argues, the structural problems with writing software mean that spending money on it does not by itself guarantee success. Writing software mean that spending money on it does not by itself guarantee success. One great advantage possessed by startups like Tesla or Monzo
One great advantage possessed by new startups like Tesla or Monzo.
One great advantage possessed by startups like Tesla or Monzo, a newish online bank in Britain,
A newish online bank in Britain,
is that their programmers are handed a blank sheet of paper
is that their programmers are handed a blank sheet of paper
with no legacy systems to maintain
with no legacy systems to maintain,
and fewer old bugs to root out.
and with fewer old bugs to root out.
Their software is more robust
Their software is more robust,
and developers can spend more time on features that customers want.
and developers can spend more time on features that customers want.
If that is cold comfort for older companies
If that is cold comfort for old companies
that have no easy way of starting afresh,
that have no easy way of starting afresh,
computing greybeards offer reassurance
computer graybeards offer reassurance
after a fashion.
after a fashion.
The startups' advantages will, they predict,
The startups' advantages they predict
prove temporary.
Bugs
will creep in. Bodge jobs will go unfixed.
Bugs will creep in. Bodge jobs will go unfixed.
Developers will leave.
Developers will leave,
taking knowledge with them. Today's feisty usurpers will become tomorrow's clumsy incumbents.
Today's feisty usurpers will become tomorrow's clumsy incumbents,
held back by their
antiquated, unreliable IT,
and ripe for disruption in turn.